Hi, welcome to RTO Doctor. My name is Lauren Hollows. I'm one of the directors of RTO Doctor, along with Raylene Bartlett, and we are happy to introduce you to our first official video podcast. Over the next coming months, we're going to endeavor to bring you a range of information on topics around assessment, development, resource development, and compliance in the VET industry. And we're going to be starting it today with Assessment Tool Mapping Guide Best Practice. So we're going to talk very briefly about the components that need to be in a mapping guide nowadays. We're not going to be talking about the streamline mapping. That's going to be coming up in a future podcast, but we will talk about what is required to be put into an assessment tool mapping guide, and we're also going to talk about how the principles of assessment and rules of evidence can be applied when you're doing your mapping practices. If you have any questions about today's topic, or you would like to suggest a future topic for another podcast, or just get in contact with us for a range of other reasons, you can find all of our contact details at our website at www.rtodoctor.com.au. Alternatively, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or you can download our app from Google Play or iTunes. So, moving into the main section, as we said today, what we're going to be talking about is assessment tool mapping guide practices. And quite often this can be a really confusing subject for a lot of RTOs. So the very first thing that you need to make sure that you're doing is when you're mapping your assessments, you need to make sure that you've got a guide that covers all of the components of a unit. So as many people would know, what you're going to start with is you're going to start with your elements and performance criteria, and you're also going to include your required skills and knowledge. And these are areas that we find that most RTOs don't have a problem with. They understand how to map them. They understand the requirement that they do need to be put into their mapping guides. Some of the areas where we do find that people may not be covering is making sure you're looking at your critical aspects of assessment. And you also need to be reading through your context of assessment and required resources and methods of assessment, because there are areas in there where the training package may actually require you to map some of those elements as well. So it might be that there are certain resources required, or there might be that there is specific assessment required. Specifically with some training packages, it does specify that training is required and assessment is required in the workplace. This is going to become much more important moving forward as we move into the streamlined training packages, because these elements, particularly around what requirements need to be assessed in the workplace, are going to become more stringent and more explicit. So it's good practice for RTOs to start getting used to that now and making sure that they're complying with their training package standards. The other area where we do find a lot of RTOs, a lot of trainers and assessors really struggle, is around the mandatory range statement components. So within all of your training packages, there is generally a range statement that most training packages will have. Some training packages are more explicit than others, but in a lot of training packages, you do have areas where it will be very clear that it says, for example, a risk is, and it provides a definition of what the risk is, or it states that, for example, in your WHS units, it might say WHS housekeeping includes, or risks and hazards include, or it might even go to the extent where it say it must include. Any of that kind of language that doesn't allow the may, so it doesn't give you the option as to whether or not you may or may not include this, then you need to be making sure that you're including that in your mapping guide practices. And again, as I said, that's an area where a lot of RTOs, a lot of trainers and assessors will often miss out. Some auditors may not require it, but in general there are more and more auditors that are requiring that you are mapping those components of the unit. And because the unit doesn't provide for the language that you may or may not need to include it, it is definitely best practice that you are including all of that information in your mapping guides. So now that you've actually got all of the information put into your mapping guide template, what you want to be making sure is that you're covering off your principles of assessment and your rules of evidence in the assessment tools that you're developing. Now, as many of you would know, the principles of assessment, there are 4 principles of assessment. You've got validity, reliability, flexibility, and fairness. And definitely validity and reliability are very, very much interconnected. So when we look at reliable and valid assessments, what we're generally looking for, the first thing is that you're going to be covering all 4 dimensions of competency, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit. We're also making sure that you're using the process which integrates the required skills and the required knowledge, and and generally that means that it's a holistic assessment. So in an ideal scenario, you're providing an assessment that allows for both the skills to be demonstrated and the knowledge to be, explicitly explained as well. This might mean that you're providing a practical assessment with competency conversation, or it might be that you're splitting that assessment up and you're doing a demonstration of skills for one part, and then you might be doing a knowledge-based test for another. You also want to be making sure that you're gathering evidence on a number of occasions and in a range of contexts. And again, this comes back to the fact that you're not using one assessment. You're using assessments that cover a range of time. It's not all happening on one day in one period, and it's happening in a range of different contexts. So in an ideal scenario, you're doing some in the workplace, and you might be doing some out of the workplace as well. This isn't always possible depending on the packages. There are safety issues which can be involved, or it might be that the student's not currently in employment. So there are definitely ways around this at times. However, again, what we're going to see moving into the streamlined training packages is that there's going to be more and more of a requirement for you to be getting those students into the workplace to practice those skills. So again, it's something that, as a practice for all of you moving forward, you definitely want to be moving in that direction, that regardless of the training and the target groups that you're working with, you're making sure that they are having the opportunity to go and participate in a workplace and apply their skills and have their skills assessed in a workplace. Again, on a number of occasions means that we don't want to be seeing one-off assessments. Auditors don't want to be seeing one-off assessments. And realistically, if we look at it in general over a period of time, it's very easy for a student to perhaps memorize an answer or demonstrate a skill as a one-off. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're competent. So really, to make sure that you're getting that full picture of competency, you need to be doing it over a number of occasions. And the last thing is that you're providing for recognition of competency no matter how or when they've been acquired, and that also plays into flexibility and fairness as well. Now, some training packages are much more explicit on this, so even if you are reading very religiously through your qualification guides and your unit descriptions, it is really important that you're actually going through the assessment requirements that your training packages are providing for as well. There are several training packages which are very explicit that they expect to see training happening on multiple occasions. Therefore, doing assessment all in one day as a one-off would definitely not meet those requirements. Moving on to flexibility and fairness. So generally in flexibility and fairness, what we're talking about is we're going to be talking about whether or not you're meeting reasonable adjustment, that you're providing some sort of contextualization for your students as well. So if you are purchasing off-the-shelf resources, then you need to be taking those off-the-shelf resources and making sure that they're contextualized to your target groups. And again, this is another focus that we've seen a lot of auditors, particularly lately, focusing on for those providers that are purchasing off-the-shelf resources. There's nothing wrong with purchasing off-the-shelf resources as long as you're contextualizing them to your target group and you're actually undergoing your own validation and moderation processes to make sure that they actually meet all of the requirements of the unit. So that kind of covers flexibility and fairness. It also will often cover means making sure that you are actually providing very clear instructions to your students, that your students understand the point of the assessment, that they're understanding the purpose and what they're supposed to be demonstrating. So just making sure that you're providing really clear assessments and guidelines for both your students and your assessors, if your assessors are not the ones actually developing your training resources and assessment resources, making sure that everybody has a really clear understanding of how those assessments are being run, how they're being provided, and the answers that are going to be expected of the students in order to be able to say, yes, they are competent, or no, they are not competent. Okay, so that is basically your principles of assessment. So making sure that you're covering validity, reliability, flexibility, and fairness, and that's something that you should be able to very clearly demonstrate through your assessment tool mapping guides. Both through making sure that everything is covered and then also through the instructions that you might be providing along with that assessment tool mapping guide and the assessment tools themselves. Okay, moving on from the principles of assessment, we also look at the rules of evidence. And again, the first thing that we come up with the rules of evidence, we have 4. We've got valid, sufficient, current, and authentic. And valid very much ties back into validity, which is in the principles of assessment. So generally just making sure that there's that very clear relationship between the evidence requirements of the unit and then the judgment which is made. And what they're looking for in general is we're looking for consistency. So what one student does, what is expected of one student is what is expected of another student at the end of the day in regards to that competency outcome. How they get there might be slightly different, but the actual final outcome needs to be consistent within the RTO, and ideally it should be consistent across RTOs as well. So that's what we're looking for when we're looking at how you're demonstrating your validity. Obviously, sufficiency, again, this comes back to making sure that you're addressing all your 4 dimensions of competency, which, as I said, we'll go into in just a little minute. And when you're covering it under sufficiency as well, again, this pulls back into the fact that you're covering it either over multiple occasions, you're using multiple assessment methods, basically boiling down to the fact that this is not a one-off. This is a process that's done over a period of time. And it's not just, one type of assessment made on one single occasion. The judgment has been developed over a period. As you know, the currency is fairly straightforward when it comes to assessments. In the majority of cases, when you're assessing a student, taking them through their standard assessment pathways, you're going to provide them with some training, you'll provide them with their assessment, and then you'll deem them as competent. Where currency can become an issue, and definitely this is something that's being looked at more and more in the industry, is through RPL. We'll do another podcast in the future, coming up in the next couple of months, focusing on RPL practices and best practices for RPL. But generally what we recommend at RTO Doctor is that when you're talking about currency for RPL, you're looking at the skills and knowledge that they've demonstrated and practiced within the last 12 months, pushing that out to 18 months, and at the very most we would be saying looking at the last 24 months. If you've got somebody that hasn't demonstrated or doesn't have any current evidence that they can demonstrate that those skills and knowledge have been practiced and improved upon in the last 2 years. So, for example, if you're looking at a chefing qualification and they haven't worked in the industry for 3 or 4 years, then in general, you're going to be needing to either do some additional training or do some additional assessment to make sure that that skills and knowledge is current. We've got a little bit more information about this on our website, so feel free to go and take a look at that. But the reason why we make that determination is because that's what we're seeing as a reflection of what is expected across the industry, what is expected from the industries that that we are deeming people competent in, and also what is being expected from a range of auditors out there in industry, both in the state and national regulatory bodies. And obviously the last one is basically dealing around authenticity, making sure that you're doing the candidate's own work. So this is mainly problematic with providers who provide solely online delivery and online assessment. If you do provide online delivery and solely provide online assessment, then what you would be needing to make sure is that you've got substantial processes in place to make sure that you have ways of checking that it actually is the student's own work. Obviously, our preference would always be that there is at least one form of direct evidence, so that through some module you're physically seeing the students demonstrate those skills, that you're physically asking the student a question and they're providing you with an answer. Now that can be done through a video conference at times. However, again, what we would be definitely suggesting is that you've got some sort of practical demonstration or a practical competency conversation when you're providing your assessments. Now that does bring us just really quickly into the 3 different types of evidence, and obviously we've got the 3 different types of evidence that you will see on a mapping guide. Is you first got your direct evidence, and this is obviously one of the best forms of evidence. So when you're dealing with direct evidence, it means that you've done a direct observation of the student providing that knowledge, or a direct observation of the student conducting that skill. Now that might be through, as I said, a practical assessment, an observation, a knowledge-based test that's done directly in front of you, or a range of other methods. So that's your primary form of evidence, and definitely in your assessment tool mapping guide you would want to make sure that at least one of your forms of assessment is covered by direct evidence. You've also got indirect evidence, which might be a written assignment. For example, the student might go away, they might have to produce a project, or they might have to produce, write up a policy or procedure or something along those lines. That would be considered indirect evidence. And quite often for some units, you will have to rely on indirect evidence because of the nature of the performance criteria or the required skill or knowledge, because it's something that's not done over a short period of time. It might be something that needs to be demonstrated over a period of time, particularly when it comes to managerial or leadership skills. And then the last one is third-party evidence. Now, definitely what we're seeing in industry is that if you're going to be using third-party evidence, that really is supplementary evidence. If you only had one assessment and then you were providing some supplementary evidence, it would definitely not be what we would be considering best practice. What you're going to be aiming for at every occasion is that you've got a minimum of 2 forms, and ideally you'll have 3 of direct and indirect evidence. Supplementary evidence in general is not really well accepted by auditors in industry. And another issue that often comes up with supplementary or third-party reports in particular is that it's a direct copy and paste of the performance criteria and required skills and knowledge. And realistically, if you're getting somebody in industry to sign this off, the majority of industry employers do not understand the language that a lot of the units are written in. And definitely, if you do insist on using a third-party report, then you can do that as a form of supplementary evidence. But what you want to be making sure is that you're then taking that knowledge and transferring it into industry language. So take the performance criteria, look at what the essence of it is, look at how it would be applied in the workplace, transfer it into that language, perhaps provide an example of exactly what an employer is going to be looking for the student to be performing in order to be able to be demonstrating competency of that skill. And if you're going to be using third-party reports, then that's definitely what you will need to be doing. And then you'll need to be making sure that you take that through your own validation and moderation processes as well. There are a lot more strict requirements in industry now in regards to being able to sign off competency. So unless your supervisors in industry that you're working with do have the necessary requirements in that they are they've got their TAE and things like that, then it will not be considered a form of direct or indirect evidence, and the majority of assessors or auditors in industry will not accept that as a primary form of evidence. So just to be aware of that. As I said, the last thing that we said that we would cover would be the 4 dimensions of competency. And the 4 dimensions of competency are task skills, task management skills, contingency management skills, and job role environment skills. So again, what this is looking at how you're contextualizing your units, particularly some of your units that might be quite generic to a range of qualifications, things like first aid, WHS units, communication units that may cross across a lot of different qualifications and training packages. So just making sure that they have the ability to demonstrate all of the task skills, but that they also have the ability to manage the contingencies that will happen out depending on their industry. And then the job role environment skills will often be related to some of those employability skills and things like that you do see that match up. Now, when you're dealing with your employability skills, what you want to be making sure is that if you are creating a mapping guide for your employability skills, that you're making sure that the employability skills are not specific for that unit, they're specific to the qualification that the student is undertaking at that time. So example, if you're using one of those common core units, for example, work effectively with others, which is in the business training package, or if you're doing a qualification in the community services or healthcare package, you might have a WHS unit, which is might cover a wide range of qualifications. You need to be making sure that the employability skills that you're mapping, the employability skills that you're assessing against, are specific to the correct qualification. They're not generic, they are very specific for each of those qualifications, and those are the ones that you need to be looking at. So that basically covers everything that we have for today. As I said, if you have any questions about this topic, please feel free to email us, or you can give us a shout out or a tweet on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. We're more than happy to answer your questions and get the information out there in industry. We will have more of these coming up in future months. We're going to be endeavouring to get one out every month. And if you've got a topic that you're really interested in, please feel free to send us an email and let us know what you're thinking. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Lauren Hollows for RTO Doctor.